see it. You may want to Google it and watch it. There'll be some maybe some questions on the debate. The other thing I'm going to ask you to do for the quiz, and this is something that we'll be talking about that I think is extremely important today, and that is the Declaration. Well, actually, we talked about it on Tuesday, but that is the Declaration of Independence. I really want you all to understand the impact of that document, legalizing revolution, the revolutionary aspect of that, to understand the dilemma that these men took on by signing their names, by voting on it. I know there is controversy. I know people want to say that it was all men, that they didn't respect women. I know people want to say a good chunk of those founding fathers owned slaves. Equality, what exactly did equality mean? I'm not justifying or rationalizing any of these issues. We can't change history. But when you look at that document and how important it is and how it still today is making us reflect as a nation on what our values and principles are, it is a huge, magnificent document. So I want you all to read it as part of your preparation for the quiz. You might see some questions on the actual Declaration of Independence. That being said, let's go on to the revolution and to lecture. And we will go to it as soon as my link lets me. And it's taking its sweet time. Have you all had any issues with Blackboard recently? I'm having a lot of issues this whole week. It's been pretty intense. Like right now, it's not letting me scroll down on my files. It's I correctly posted a link or got my Blackboard Ultra video for the class link for the class today, and this morning I noticed it had changed the times to random times. So I don't know what's going on, but I know there's something going on with Blackboard. So please, please be careful that you're checking it daily in case something strange happens. Okay, so let's get to the actual fighting of the War of Independence. I'm going to go ahead. If we have time, I'll go ahead and see a video clip of a movie called The Patriot, and that was about the Revolutionary War. But I really want to get everything in for today's lecture. So let's work on this first, and then maybe we'll get a chance to see a little bit of the final scene of The Patriot. So we took a look at the pros and cons, I shouldn't say pros and cons, the disadvantages and the advantages of the British Army, of the British, and of the Continental Army, of the Patriots. And one of the things I really, really want to emphasize, hopefully I did on Tuesday, is that the Continental Army had a lot of things against it. I mean, when we talk about, oh yes, England had very powerful enemies, and if the young United States could get those enemies to be their allies, they might get supplies, they might get money, they might get navy, they might get other things that they can use, but it's always an if. Yes, the Continental Army had a short supply line, but it was only good if they actually got enough supplies. There was always an if to the Continental Army. Yes, they were excellent sharpshooters. Yes, they had guerrilla warfare tactics down. But we're not sure if that's going to work. It's an if. They're going up against one of the most powerful armies in the world, against definitely the most powerful navy in the world. And it's not that much of a sure thing. Armies are not made on confidence alone. Armies are not made on cause alone. There has to be training. There has to be discipline. There has to be organization. And that is why for George Washington as commander-in-chief from the very beginning, it was very imperative to him to get training done. To the point where even perhaps the Continental Congress is thinking you're overtraining, because it's just like you're training and you're training and you're training and you're training. And why is he spending so much training? Because he understands the British Army. He understands the techniques, the discipline, the organization. He understands that army system, and he knows what they're up against. He is working with, at best, men that have been in a militia. A militia is not a trained army. A militia, like the Minutemen, were men that were ready to protect their village in a minute's notice, but that doesn't mean that they have the training to engage in formal battles. They need training, discipline, planning, drills. It needs to become second nature to them to fight. I want you also to understand that the majority of the people, the men fighting in the Continental Army, were farmers, yeoman farmers. Again, the number one occupation in the colonies, now United States of America, was a yeoman farmer. Well, farmers need to be home to plant. Farmers need to be home to harvest. Farmers need to be working in their lands. One of the key things that Washington is having to deal with is very often his soldiers and throughout many of his other generals' troops, there was this not leaving the cause, but they would leave. They would go home, check on their stuff, and then maybe come back. And so training and discipline and planning, I mean, this is all stuff that Washington really feels he's got to just pour it on thick on these soldiers. Now, that doesn't mean that Washington is not opposed to using the American tactics, those new tactics that the Americans, the patriots, have picked up after years and years of living in the Americas, of living on the frontier, Native American influence, those hit and run tactics, guerrilla warfare. He's not opposed to it, and he really sees that this type of tactics are key for a couple of things. One, they can be great morale boosters for his army, for the patriot cause, but they also can show foreign governments that the Americans have a way to win. It may not be what they're thinking as in formal battles, but they have effective tools. He also feels that it is a way to hurt Great Britain, but he knows, though, more than anything, he's going to need an army. So as much as he's not opposed to guerrilla warfare, and he uses it, and many generals of the Continental Army and soldiers of the Continental Army will be experts at this, but Washington doesn't want that to be the main focus. He realizes that he needs an army. He needs a formal, trained army to actually win this. There's another thing, and I don't have it up on this PowerPoint, and I should have fixed it last night. I apologize, I forgot. I wanted to add that there's something else that Washington will utilize, and something that hasn't really gotten a lot of light until perhaps the last few years, last 10 or 20 years, but that is the use of spies, intelligence. Washington is going to have a huge spy network in the New York area. It will be key to a lot of his movements, to victories that the Continental Army will have, and he will have a spy network really throughout many of the states. So it is the use of intelligence that will become quite key to helping Washington eventually win. Spoiler, he does win. So I do want to talk about other soldiers, not just the yeoman farmers, but about slaves that fought in the Continental Army. The words of Thomas Jefferson of equality and inalienable rights affects many. And there will be among African Americans and even among some slaves this idea that, does that mean us? What does that mean? And they are affected by that. There will be 5,000 African American troops fighting in the Continental Army. There will be 2 all-Black units fighting in the Continental Army. Slaves will fight in the Continental Army, and they were promised that they would be given their freedom if they served. They had to serve so many tours of duty, so to speak, there was a term to their serving, and if they survived, they were promised their freedom. In areas like southern states, the Carolinas, particularly South Carolina and Georgia, so the more southern of the states, where there was a much larger slave population, there will be many slaves that will actually fight with the British. And some historians have reported at least 10,000, but others have said there were more than 10,000 that actually served with the British in different capacities. Many of these will actually leave with the British when the British lose. And in fact, the clip I wanted to show you from The Patriot actually has a slave who is fighting his last kind of tour, and he realizes that if he survives, he would be given his freedom at the end of this battle. And that's kind of part of that final scene. But before we even see that clip, what's happening 1775 to 1776? Remember, they're already fighting the War of Independence even before we've declared independence. Well, it's totally demoralizing. It is just defeat after defeat after defeat. I mean, it's just bad news, tragic news arriving in Philadelphia at the Continental Congress. I mean, it gets to the and others within the Continental Congress throughout 1775, getting all the way to July of 1776, that cause for independence grows. So despite all this just very demoralizing defeats, the cause still grows. Now, Great Britain, in kind of the first phase of the war, is realizing that they or feel, I shouldn't say they realize it, but they feel that the key radical element was in New England, particularly Massachusetts, particularly the Boston area. They're like, this is the root of everything. So it becomes kind of their strategy in that first phase of the war, the first years of the war, to cut off Massachusetts. Actually, better than cutting off Massachusetts, just to cut all New England off from the rest of the 13 states. So the idea was, around July 1776, they remove a big chunk of their troops and relocate them from Boston south to New York City. And in New York City, they felt that from there, they could eventually cut off New England. If you think about where New York is, and if you go north of New York, you actually hit Canada. Canada was British. The idea was you could kind of use soldiers from the Canadian area and from New York, and eventually just kind of hook up through northern New York, and you just kind of isolate, cut off New England, everything to the north of New York. as well as the fact that New York had a much better natural harbor. It was in a more strategic location. It was a little bit closer to the southern states. And so for the British, this they realized was a lot more ideal than trying to fight and be based out of Boston. So it's this idea that they relocate their kind of main group down to the New York City area. And there, under General Sir William Howe and getting naval support from Howe's brother, Admiral Lord Richard Howe, the British are now going into this phase where we are going to try to isolate and cut off New England. They will have very swift victories throughout New York, the countryside of New York, going down south into New Jersey. Washington will have to retreat south. He had been based in and around the New York area, and he actually has to retreat south. And he crosses the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. So think about it. Where is the Continental Congress? The Continental Congress is convened in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Washington is now retreating further and further south, and he's now into Pennsylvania. He has crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. So when we talk about retreat and retreat and retreat, I mean, this is getting very, very scary. But on December 17th, 1776, something that becomes a very big morale booster for the Continental Army and for the Continental Congress happens. Washington will cross back over the Delaware on December 25th, 1776, and attack a Hessian, remember the Hessian mercenaries, so a Hessian camp in the darkness of December 25th, 1776. This is Trenton, the very famous crossing the Delaware. In the middle of the night, Washington quietly and stealthily crossing the Delaware. As you can see from this painting done by Emmanuel Lutzy in 1851, one of the most famous paintings about this event, Washington crossing the Delaware, it is called. You can see the ice, the coldness. This is Christmas Day night. And Washington with his soldiers, you can kind of see back here, all the soldiers crossing this very frigid waters to surprise attack, hit and run, guerrilla warfare at this camp in Trenton, New Jersey. It is an excellent example of hit and run tactics. Washington and his men were successful. It was unexpected. It was a surprise attack. The Hessians, it was Christmas Day. They had no expectation that they would be attacked that evening, going into the 26th morning of, and it was just a complete victory for Washington. A morale booster at its most needed. Did it secure lots of land for the Continental Army? No, but it gave them something to hold on to. As they get into 1777, the winter gets extremely hard. And again, the Continental Army overall throughout the states, it is all basically the same thing, low on supplies. And even though the news spreads about Trenton, overall morale was down. As 1777 continues going into spring and fall, it's just very demoralizing. We're not seeing any major victory happening for the Continental Army. Finally, though, the Continental Army has its most important victory in the fall of 1777 at the Battle of Saratoga. Saratoga is in upper state New York. Through intelligence gathering, the Continental Army is able to get the British plans very quickly. I shouldn't say very quickly, but they're able to get their plans and put together a plan of action. The idea was British General Burgoyne, who was coming down south from the English Canadian territory, coming into upper state New York, was going to eventually hook up with General Howe, who would be going from New York City area and going north. And they would hook up in the New York countryside and effectively isolate completely New England and carry on, they hoped, successful victories from there. Well, American General Horatio Gates will quickly spring into action, and he heads off and cuts off Burgoyne and Saratoga at Saratoga, New York. The Battle of Saratoga on October 7th, 1777 was the first major formal victory for the Continental Army. It was huge. It was also desperately needed. This battle is key to getting foreign aid, to getting foreign recognition, to getting alliances with people or countries like France and Spain. It is huge. Now, when we talk about foreign aid and foreign help, we have to understand that actually, kind of secretly, the United States had already started to get foreign aid. Money, slight funds had been starting to come in. Advisors from foreign governments had come in, particularly the French. The Devalier cannon had been brought over from France. In fact, that cannon was key in the victory in Saratoga. So it's not like they hadn't really gotten involved. It just was in a much more low-key way. King Louis XVI and the French had been eyeing this War of Independence, this revolt, very carefully. They, in many ways, had been itching, if you want to think about it that way, to get involved. Not because necessarily they supported independence of the colonies, but it's Great Britain. They want to get in and make Great Britain pay. This is their chance. Remember what happened to them. But they are not formally getting involved in any of this if they think they will lose. They've already lost their continental colonies in the Americas. They are out of the Americas, the continental Americas. So, I mean, for them to get involved in this and possibly lose again is just, they can't do that. They can't afford that. So if they get involved, they almost need 100% assurance, which, I mean, obviously you can't have, but I mean, they need an assurance that at least they have a really good chance at winning. Battle of Saratoga. The Continental Army was able to prove that in a formal battle, not a guerrilla warfare tactic, not a skirmish, but in a formal battle, they could win. So it was key. The French will quickly agree to two treaties with the United States, and it is the Treaty of Amity and Commerce and the Treaty of Alliance. The French become, in essence, the first country to recognize, through these treaties, recognize our independence. They become the first country to officially say they will trade with us, they will help us, they will give us supplies, they will ally themselves, they will help us with navy, with soldiers, with guns and ammunition and money. And one of the most important things the French will help with is not so much the guns and the navy and the ammunition, and the money, which was greatly needed. the War of Independence, and that was Marquis de Lafayette. His full name, Gilbert du Motier, Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette was a young military strategist, and when I say he's young, he's, I believe, in his early 20s, if that. He might have actually been a little bit younger. He was very well renowned as having a great military brain. He was a young French nobleman, and he very much supported the patriot cause. He will become George Washington's most trusted advisor, his right hand, in many ways. Some people have argued perhaps Alexander Hamilton, who becomes his private aide, secretary aide during the war, but a lot of people probably would argue it was Lafayette who actually was his most trusted confidant. Lafayette is going to be key in many battles, but particularly in the Battle of Yorktown. Speaking back about foreign aid, though, the Spanish. After the French, we have the Spanish that will recognize the independence of the United States, as well as become an ally with the United States in this movement, this revolutionary war, much more than a movement. Spain, like France, has the same motivation, that revenge factor, that we must beat Great Britain down, and so thus the alliance with the United States. Spain will send guns, ships, men, navy, and one of their big gifts, I guess, or things that they bring to the United States will be Bernardo de Galvez, who is in the Spanish Navy and key in controlling the British Navy in the South Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. Other foreign countries will recognize the independence and aid in various ways. The Netherlands, remember the Dutch? They have an axe to grind as well. Prussian nobles of different kingdoms along the German, Russian, Polish areas. Polish advisors. You're seeing many independent and small kingdoms getting involved in this, and at least recognizing the independence of the United States. But even after the Battle of Saratoga, okay, in 1777, winter hits, we go into early 78, and it is almost as if the winter was even harder than anything that they had seen before. Washington is in the Valley Forge area, kind of hunkering down through the winter. It is very, very cold. He sees the needs of his soldiers, and we're not talking necessarily gunpowder now. He's seeing that they need boots, they need coats. They are wrapping themselves in blankets. They are wrapping their feet in blankets. There are, in his diary about his time in Valley Forge, that he could see where his men had trained, because he could find their bloody tracks from their feet. That was basically bare feet marching for some in the cold snow. Washington will use a lot of his private money, his own funds, to pay his soldiers and to get supplies. This is a very famous painting about the winter at Valley Forge called The March to Valley Forge by William Trego in the 19th century, 1883 to be exact. And you can see the Continental Army. I mean, they're just dressed in rags. You can see the hunched over, tired, their feet also covered in blankets. I mean, this is a very, very precarious time. But by 1780, the British are kind of wanting to just end this war as soon as possible. And so they're going to switch their strategy. They go into the second phase. And this strategy now is going to focus more in the South. Their idea about the South was that they assumed and felt that in the South, from Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, that there was a lot more loyalist support. Loyalists were what was referred to as those that were still loyal to the king and to the parliament. The Patriots called them the Tories and saw them as traitors to their cause. But if you all remember when we talked about the origins and the evolutions of the colonies, the South did always reflect more of a cultural tie with Mother England. And so the English really feel that down in the South that they will have more loyalist support. They not only think they have more loyalist support there, they think that the loyalists or the Tories will actually support them physically. They will actually engage in the fighting, that they will really, really help them down in the South. Both of these things were assumptions, and they were overestimated assumptions. They were never fully realized. So the British will move many of their troops, and I'll jump real quick to the next slide, will very quickly start moving troops in the 1780, down from the New York area, and here you see them coming down. Charlestown, Savannah, very quickly fall to the British. And it really isn't until October 7th, 1780, that you see a really big victory for the Continental Army at the Battle of Kings Mountain, October 7th, 1780. This is where you start seeing, when you're studying the War of Independence, that loyalist support, that loyalist fighters and the loyalists hating the British, it wasn't materializing. Another thing that we're going to see down in the South, really, probably much more than we saw up in the North, was the great use of guerrilla warfare, or hit and run tactics. In fact, guerrilla warfare becomes the hallmark of fighting the War of Independence in the South. And one of the great users of guerrilla warfare, General Nathaniel Greene. But as we get into 1780 and 1781, Great Britain is realizing, this War of Independence, which was, we thought, going to end quickly, has now kind of become really problematic. They are fighting it on many fronts. They are fighting it, obviously, in the Americas. They are also fighting the French. They are also fighting the Spanish now. And there's also another aspect of the war that we haven't really touched on. In England itself, the merchants that had been trading with the colonies, that had relied on the colonial trade, 1/4, remember, we were 1/4 of the English trade. 1/4 of English goods was, in effect, traded with the colonies. We were a huge trading partner for the English merchants. And that obviously is now disrupted. So Great Britain, in its own homeland, is having a lot of pressure to end the war. Not so much about necessarily winning or losing, to just end this war, because many of the merchants want to go back to doing business, whether the colonies are the colonies or whether they are the United States of America. So you're starting to see a lot of pressure here, and we're on the road now to the finale. General Cornwallis, and I'll kind of jump real quick here. General Cornwallis, who British fleet coming in with reinforcements. General Washington is going to hear about Cornwallis's movements, and he is going to rush down south. He had been here in the White Plains, southern New York, northern Pennsylvania, New Jersey area, and he's going to march through New Jersey all the way down to the Yorktown Peninsula to engage General Cornwallis. What's the big deal about General Cornwallis is that Cornwallis was, in effect, the most important general of all the British forces in the Americas at the time. And engaging him and beating him would be a significant way to end the war. So Washington rushes down. Information is given to the French and the Spanish. The French, here is de Grasse, Admiral de Grasse and his French fleet, are all going to kind of protect and surround the Yorktown Peninsula. Washington is coming down to Yorktown. You have Lafayette, who also will be involved in this war. And if y'all know what a peninsula is, and this kind of shows the overestimation Cornwallis had of his force and the underestimated view he had of the Continental Army, a peninsula is one of the worst places to camp. Why? Because a peninsula is surrounded by, on three sides, water, and you have a land bridge that connects you to the land on one side. If you camp there, the enemy can very easily just cut off the land bridge. And you're isolated on the peninsula, unless you have ships to get out. But if the enemy also cuts you off on the water, you are in effect surrounded. And that is exactly what happens to Cornwallis. He completely underestimated the Continental Army and the French Navy and the Spanish. The Spanish had actually cut off the British naval advancements that were coming. So you had kind of a ring around the peninsula by the French, and then you have the Spanish that are further out in the Atlantic, cutting off further British naval advancements. Cornwallis is surrendered. I mean, surrounded. He does surrender because he is surrounded. And he is just, even then, he is just cannot believe this. I mean, he cannot believe that this has happened. This is just not feasible. Very much underestimated Washington, very much underestimated the Continental Army, and overestimated himself and his army. Even at the surrender, there was a formal, how would you call it, a formal ritual, if you want to think about it, a formal way to surrender. It's kind of not a procedure, but the surrendering general gives his sword over, and it's just kind of a formal way to surrender, I guess we could say. Well, Cornwallis is just beside himself. This is just beneath him. He can't even fathom the idea. He actually completely disrespects George Washington because it doesn't even personally go to the surrendering ceremony. He sends his secretary, which really was a slap in the face of Washington, a slap in his reputation, the way that Cornwallis would see it. But again, Washington just takes it in stride. I'm sure it bothered him, but they'd won the battle. Why worry about that? There's other things that are much more important. They won the battle. Now, in effect, the war is over. He is the most important general. He is the highest ranking general. He is kind of the head poobah, if you want to think about it, and he has surrendered. There are still some more skirmishes that will happen really until about 1783, but in effect, the war is over. delegation had actually been negotiating with British representatives for some years. Remember, the British are feeling big pressure from their merchants to end this war. And this delegation, led by Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, who would later become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the first Chief Justice, and John Adams, are trying to negotiate a peace treaty with the British representatives. And so really by 1783, there is just so much pressure by the merchants that, I mean, there was already pressure even before the Battle of Yorktown, but I mean, the pressure has intensified now even more so after Yorktown, that Jay, Adams, and Franklin are able to put together a peace treaty that is perhaps the most surprising and unexpected of all peace treaties. It definitely was a shock to the Americans. They are beyond excited about it. They're like, yay! But it's probably more of a shock because the terms didn't even fathom that this were the terms to the peace treaty. Now, the Treaty of Paris 1783 ends the War of Independence. What are the points of the Treaty of Paris? Well, England recognizes that the United States is independent of England. They are independent on their own. They are the United States of America. Okay, so that's okay. Everybody, I mean, that's more than okay. That's great. But I mean, that was what had been expected. Now come the unexpected things. England will cede to the United States of America all its lands south of Canada, so south of the Great Lakes, and all the way to the Mississippi River. All those lands that the Proclamation of 1763 had told the colonists they line of Canada. So that was huge. England then further says that they will remove all soldiers that they have in the forts in the Ohio River Valley, which for the U.S. now, geographically, was its Northwest Territory now. And the U.S. promised to pay all the debts that they had with merchants before the war. So that was something for the merchants that had really wanted to get back to business, that the U.S. will pay their debts that they had with these merchants contracted before the war. And also, final point was that the United States promised to compensate the loyalists, those that have been loyal to England, for lands that have been confiscated during the War of Independence, and to respect their various titles to their land should they wish to stay. The idea really was that England was like, can you just, these people that supported us, please look over them. Unless they decide to leave, and then that's something different. But many of the loyalists had their lands confiscated in various states, and so this was a way of either compensating them or giving them back their lands. I mean, the Treaty of Paris of 1783 was nothing what the colonists, or now the Americans, had ever expected. It was so much more, and the war was over. They had won their independence, they had all this land, and they had a hero like no other, George Washington. George Washington is the rock star, if you want to think about that now. He is huge, huge. I mean, I wish I could explain to y'all how much now of a figure George Washington is, because it's really nothing like we've ever seen in our present state. There were people that wanted to crown George Washington king. We just fought a war to get rid of a king, and they're all like, let's make him king. He's huge. But now what? We won the war, we're independent, we got a hero, and now reality hits. We need to put together the country. What will it be like? Okay, guys, today I see that it's already 10:20, and what I'm going to do is actually end lecture a little early today. Early, about 20 minutes early. I'm going to try to show you that of the Patriots, so I hope it works. And if it doesn't, then I definitely will go ahead and dismiss you. So give me about 5 minutes to see if I can get this video for you up. If I can't in 5 minutes, I will dismiss you. Okay, so let me work on this real quick. I think, let me stop sharing the slides. And how do I do this? I think I go to, oh, come on. Oh, okay. Ah, come on. I'm going. Don't be leaving. Okay. Okay, let me see if this is the right one. Okay, so, okay, guys, oh shoot, let me see what happened. What did I do? Where are you? Come back. Okay, I think I got it. I think we're good. Let's see if I can do this. Come on, what's going on? Share. Why won't it let me share? Okay. 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 I think this is right. Do y'all see the screen? Somebody say yes. Yes, no, maybe?
Yes, yes, we
Okay,
can
here it
see.
goes. Okay. Can you hear? Also, a little bit? Yes? Someone say yes.
No, we can't.
Can't hear? Okay. Let me see if I can. Okay. Can you hear that when I had it on?
No.
No?
No.
Oh, shoot. Mm. Anybody? Let me, maybe if I stick it with the headphones. I don't know if that will. y'all hear me now? I think I had it on mute. Sorry. Let me go back. Okay, can you hear it now?
No.
No.
No? Okay, guys. Well, I'll let y'all go because I don't know how to get the speaker to work, okay? Oh man, I know. But y'all got off early, a good 15 minutes early today. So just prepare for your lecture, look over the Declaration of Independence. If you didn't see the debate, you may